We've been doing some research that we're really aiming to complete to help shape a better integrated, collaborative governance of Canadian housing and infrastructure. That's a bit of a mouthful to start. And actually, for those of you that are having difficulty with my accent, I am speaking English. I'm sure it's even more of a mouthful. The research that we've been undertaken was financed by the Department of Housing, Infrastructure and Communities Canada as part of their RKI program. We're grateful to their support. We're grateful to the support team at McMaster and to the literally hundreds of people spread from Adelaide to Ottawa who've contributed to this program. We've posted various materials on the CHEC website, not just this video, but there's 6 papers, and paper 6 is the one with the summary and review of any proposals that we want to make to government at this time, and therefore most useful if you're going to read it before the webinar. The antecedents of this project really lie in a couple of reports I produced for CMHC in 2023 and 24, trying to develop the notion of systems thinking in terms of analysing housing systems, but also housing policy and governance systems in the Canadian context. I think we all recognise, and everyone who's in this room today will recognise that we are dealing with a polycrisis, in fact, across the Canadian context. That's been emerging not just in the last year or two, but over 20, 25 years in some regards, that despite almost 90 billion spent on the National Housing Strategy, appeared to actually spread and actually deepen and evolve into a more difficult character the more that the National Strategy actually spent resources. So obviously something was not quite right about how we understood the problem, nor how we addressed it. In the work that we did, we recognized that the outcomes that are occurring in the housing sector, homelessness, rental burdens, frustrated entry to home ownership, that sort of troublesome trinity of difficulties are really, in a sense, reducing the cohesion of Canada at a time when it's recognised for a whole range of reasons that Canada needs to be cohesive as not just a political system, but a social and economic system too. And that if we are in a context where 2 out of 3 Canadians see something problematic about their housing, that's a system problem. They're also well aware that left behind people in left behind places, their numbers are not diminishing, and that the number of left behind younger people stalled, the younger generation stalled in rented housing, expensive rental housing, frustrating their aspirations to form families and form assets, are actually important sources of fragmentation precisely when we need more coherence. So that the recommendations that we drew from the CMHC work were that we needed significant disruptions in policy in a number of regards. The first was obviously in relation to supply side, and not just planning issues, but the whole of the supply chain, disruption to the scale and functioning of the non-profit sector, amongst other things. But we also highlighted that we needed to disrupt the way we govern housing and infrastructure that supports it in the Canadian context. And one set of observations related to the governance of housing within any single order of government, say the federal level, quite often outside the Housing Ministry, there were actions taken in relation to monetary policy, sometimes fiscal policy, higher education policy, a range of major policy silos, which had actually negative effects that, in a sense, reduced the beneficial gains from the National Housing Strategy. So that not very well connected governance across departments, and you can find the same thing at provincial levels, possibly less so. And indeed, in our research, the most joined up governance of the housing system and the infrastructure system actually occurs within the large cities. There's a kind of policy conduct or practice inversion there in that the federal government's not the best integrated level in these issues, but the big metropolitan areas are. Other smaller, less well-resourced municipalities, completely different story, and I'll come back to that. But what we were particularly interested in and gave rise to this present project was the fact of lack of coordination of policy across different orders or levels of government. The mantra that has driven a lot of Canadian housing policy, and even actually left end years of the Trudeau government almost hesitant about taking a major federal step forward, a federal commitment to housing. Remember the speech in Hamilton about having no carriage? Well, subsequently, carriage and horses to pull them have been discovered. But it represented a sense of lack of cohesion in the multi-order governance of housing. Now, if policy was driven by the mantra from the mid-1990s that housing is social and social is provincial, therefore housing is primarily governed by provinces, that reflected a view that no longer really applies to the way in which we think about housing, and certainly in a systems perspective. We recognise that housing outcomes are always local. You build houses in the ground in a particular place. They have to be local. But where they're built, how they're used, and how they're paid for reflects not just local market influences, but regional and even global influences, interest rate changes and the like. But they also represent the policy effects of multiple orders of government. So that when we look at the housing system, it's both driven by multi-order decisions in the policy sphere, but also produces not just social outputs, but it produces really significant outcomes in relation to zero carbon. If I produce carbon from my house, it affects you and it affects the wider world. And equally, there are significant effects on productivity, capital markets, labour markets, and mobilities that actually come from very local housing outcomes, but that have actually national economic significance. So that when we looked at the way in which we think about the governance of housing policy in Canada, we have to begin to capture that system effect about how the world works. And in a sense, if we're going to improve the outcomes from the system, we can't really be constrained by constitutional niceties that came from a debate in the middle of the 1990s. We're 30 years on from that, and clearly that set of arrangements, that perception of what Canadian housing and infrastructure policy should be, does not work. So where do we look to for any other alternatives? Well, we want change to be strategic. We want it to be multi-sectoral in many ways. We want it to be driven by or contributed to do by different orders of government. But given that housing systems cohere at local scales, although they're driven by influences from different levels, we think that we're also searching from some much more bottom-up solution than we have at the present time. And I think effects are important. Obviously, this is not dismissing in any way the importance of provinces in the role here, but we're saying a lot of the action And a lot of the coordination, a lot of the innovation, a lot of the integration takes place at levels below these orders of government. And we have to think about, are there any examples of this kind of change? What we did was we looked at city deals that emerged in about 7 countries, mainly in Europe and Canada and Britain and Australia. And they came in to replace older forms of urban policy. I may say Canada didn't move with the times on this particular shift, but they were interested in looking at urban policy outcomes that didn't just emphasize the social, but wanted to impact growth and productivity, and indeed zero carbon as well. The second thing to say about them is that they were emphatic in the importance of developing the local or coalitions of the local as the primary focus for delivery. And I'll say just something very quickly about these different elements of what we looked at in the project. First of all, the term city deal, in a way, it doesn't really mean very much because within countries, there's a huge variation in what's within a city deal. In fact, the fact that there are bespoke deals between higher orders of government and local authorities, I don't mean any meritocratic sense in that, but simply in terms of scale, means that the role and the constituent parts differ from place to place. Local choice really matters. The second thing to say is that they actually embody national or federal government aspirations to strengthen local capacities and put resources and capabilities there. They also usually embody within the deal process requirements that localities do put in place the best practices, the best information, the best understandings, the best evaluations, the best market analysis that they can. That has often not been the case in local scale projects that use federal funds. But that's part of the deal in the city deal. It's about changing, incentivizing behaviors, but allowing these behaviors to be influenced by local decisions. After that, the key thing to say about them is they're strategic. They often last 5 to 10 years. They are voluntary. Nobody has to form a city deal. If you don't want one, don't apply. And I think that then leaves a question for government to sort out beyond that. But they are also a mechanism that were able to be introduced quickly in the countries which developed them. National governments would approach a particular set of pilots. In the UK, it was just the 8 largest cities in effect in England, and say, we want you to put up a strategic bid. It has to be well argued. There has to be a narrative for what you're going to do. You have to evaluate the proposals that you're going to articulate. You have to say what your governance arrangements will be and what's your delivery vehicle. The funding for these deals when they were driven through was primarily delivered by governments, but the intensity of funding varies very sharply across the deals. In the UK, it was major programme funding was being put on the table that was going to be geographically reallocated. It was adding to what was already there, so that getting the money was really important in terms of delivering some of the outcomes. And that was the carrot to actually persuade subnational governments, whether the devolved administration. In a Scottish context, for instance, is like a Canadian province. How do you incentivize the Scottish government as well as the cities of Glasgow and Edinburgh separately, I may say, or the metropolitan regions to bid for these deals? That required incentives to actually do that, and there was significant spending involved. The Dutch approach, for instance, was quite different. They said, there's enough programme money on the table here to actually deal with many of these urban issues that we want to tackle. What we don't have are vehicles or practices at the local scale that will deliver. We will put in place in conjunction with the municipalities in all sets of deal making. It's never a single municipality. It's a functional economic area of the metropolitan area. There's also rural regions come into this as well, although it's still called city deals for quite a long time. But in that context, the Dutch government were saying, what is really important here is there is a local vehicle that gets put in place. All the major partners of government and otherwise are part of it. They interact, they form new networks. It becomes an innovation system. It's an idea system. Practice improves, innovations improve, and when they are improved, they're transferred to national practice really quickly. That's a really important part of policy and deals that was neglected somewhat in the UK and Australia, but the Finns and the Dutch, for instance, have put it centre scale. The Finnish deals are a bit of an amalgam of British and Dutch approaches, but they're really convincing in what they do. Now, in the context, I'm happy in the webinar to talk further about evaluation processes. Evaluations are really difficult and sometimes less than convincing about how you stage payments through gateway reports in relation to monitoring, how you collaborated in adjusting the nature of a program when external shocks like the Trump tariff equivalents or Ukraine war or deciding to engage in a bit of economic self-harm and leaving the European Union. All these things were shocks to these local effects, and there had to be ways of renegotiation. That's part of the collaboration and respectful, trustful decision taking, which has actually given a real redefinition of place policy and spatial policy in the UK context. I think actually when we now look at the Canadian housing policy landscape, the federal role is much clearer. There are clear intentions, really ambitious intentions to shift the dial on the supply side of the system. We put in place a major new agency, Building Canada Homes. What we haven't put in place is any clear understanding of how governance and integration at housing market area, regional and urban, can be much better integrated with infrastructure plans. Now, I think it's somewhat unfortunate if our major cities are integrating their planning, their housing, and indeed their infrastructure decisions. And if at a federal government level, we are not doing that in the first instance and seeking all the routes to collaboration and not just public funding, but the private financing that can match that. With a landscape in which Building Canada Homes is going to be a major player, there are real questions about when it goes beyond using up public land in major pilots. What happens when one wants to go further than that? There are cities with very considerable stocks of municipal land. What's the partnership going to be? Should there be a deal arrangement? Can you use what you're doing for Build Canada Homes to trigger this kind of mechanism without putting huge amounts of additional resource on the table, other than over and above what you plan to do? And in that framework, how at a local scale does Build Canada Homes, all the infrastructure apparatus that we have, and CMHC, how do they actually integrate? If, in a sense, looking as an outsider, governance seems more complicated than it was before. And how does it engage the competence and energy that Vancouver and Edmonton and Toronto and others, and smaller places too, that we've come across in our work, how does it engage their energy in a productive, innovative vehicle that these localities feel in some sense they own? That's going to be the trick for housing outcomes to improve, for imaginative new solutions, for better practices, for instance, infrastructure charging to develop. But we need some coherence to that. And I think there's a major opportunity that is not necessarily a major additional claim on the Canadian budget. We need to put in place the mechanisms, and I think that a better integrated framework in which every order of government has to contribute, has to have standing, and actually works with each other to deliver cohesive building outcomes from the housing arrangements we presently have. I think personally, if Canada doesn't do that, there's a real danger of social and economic fragmentation that has not existed before. So I'm optimistic. Being a Scot and an economist, I'm naturally optimistic, but I do think this is time for government, federal government, not to say, hey, it's too difficult. There's provinces that don't look like this. Some of the most successful city deals in Britain are in Scotland, which just remind Canadians almost voted to become independent 10 years ago. And the second most important is Northern Ireland, which is in Northern Ireland Parliament is currently governed by Sinn Féin, who'd actually like to leave Britain and join the South. So let's define the spaces, and the space here is the housing polycrisis, where every government in every order of government in Canada agrees it's a problem. What they have to do is all agree about what the route to the solution actually is. We suggest that they have a look at what we're saying on city deals. Thanks.